On the night of my 29th birthday, at exactly 9:17 p.m., my younger sister posted a video about me that reached 2.4 million views before midnight. In it, she cried on camera and calmly told the world I was a liar who had faked my entire career, stolen $75,000 from our mother, and abandoned my family when they were sick and struggling. She said it in a soft, broken voice, the kind that makes strangers believe every word. I didn't comment. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even blink when my phone started vibrating nonstop on the kitchen counter, because I already knew something worse was coming. If you've ever had your own family destroy you in public, you know exactly how quiet it gets inside your chest. It's not anger first. It's not even sadness. It's a kind of cold, hollow silence, like standing in a snowstorm with no coat. So before I continue, tell me something in the comments. What hurts more, being betrayed by strangers or being betrayed by the people who raised you? And if you've ever watched someone twist your story until you didn't recognize your own life anymore, stay with me, because this didn't start with that video. It started 23 years earlier, in a house where love was always measured like rationed food. My name is Evelyn Grace Whitmore. I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm a digital brand strategist and content creator with just over 3.1 million followers across platforms. My work focuses on ethical marketing and transparency in influencer culture, which ironically would later become the exact weapon used against me. But when I was growing up, I was just the inconvenient daughter. My mother, Lorraine Whitmore, had a way of speaking that could slice through a room without raising her voice. She never yelled. She never hit. She simply erased you. My younger sister, Melissa Whitmore, 4 years younger, blonde, soft-spoken, effortlessly, charming, learned that skill early. By the time I was 6, I understood a simple rule in our house. Melissa was the light. I was the shadow. I still remember the day that rule became permanent. It was December 3rd when I was 9. My school held a regional science fair, and I had spent 3 months building a water filtration model using recycled materials. Out of 112 entries, I won first place. The prize was a $500 scholarship fund for future education. I ran home with the certificate clutched in my hands, heart pounding. Mom was sitting at the dining table helping Melissa practice piano. "Mom, I won," I said breathless. She glanced up for exactly 1 second before turning back to Melissa. "That's nice," she said, "but your sister has a recital tomorrow. Don't make this about you tonight." That was the first time I realized something. Achievements didn't matter. Visibility did. And in our house, there was only room for one person to be seen. By the time I was a teenager, the pattern was predictable. If I got an A, Mom would say Melissa was more creative. If I earned money, tutoring, Mom would ask why I wasn't more generous toward family. If relatives praised me, Melissa would suddenly become fragile or overwhelmed, and the attention would shift instantly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was subtle, quiet, and constant, like water dripping on stone. When I turned 18, I left for the University of Washington with exactly $2,300 in savings and a promise to myself that I would never rely on my family again. And I didn't. By 23, I was freelancing. By 26, I built my own consulting agency. By 28, I had clients that included national retail brands and nonprofit organizations. From the outside, my life looked like a clean success story. But here's the truth. Most people don't understand about rising in public while carrying private wounds. Success doesn't silence family resentment. It amplifies it. The first time Melissa hinted at that resentment publicly was 2 years ago during a live stream collaboration we did together, a rare attempt on my part to repair our relationship. A viewer asked her what it was like having a successful older sister. She smiled sweetly and said, laughing, "Oh, Evelyn always knew how to make things look perfect online." The chat flooded with art emojis. No one noticed the way she emphasized the word look. I did, and so did my mother, who called me later that night. "You should be careful," she said quietly. "People who build reputations on appearances fall harder when the truth comes out." I remember holding the phone in silence, feeling something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, recognition, because she didn't say if the truth comes out. She said when. For the next year, small things started happening. Strangers messaged me, accusing me of being fake. Anonymous accounts left comments claiming I had family skeletons. A few brand partnerships asked unusually detailed questions about my personal background. At first, I thought it was normal internet noise, until I noticed something specific. Every rumor contained private details only my family would know. Things I had never shared publicly. Things I had only ever told my mother or Melissa. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped confronting them. I stopped defending myself. I stopped reacting. Instead, I started watching. Because I had learned one thing from growing up in that house: the most dangerous people always reveal themselves when they think you're powerless. And my family believed I was completely unprepared for what they were about to do. They thought the birthday video was the beginning of my collapse. They didn't know it was actually the final piece of evidence I had been waiting for. But what they also didn't know, what no one knew at that moment, was this: that video wasn't just a smear campaign. It was tied to something far bigger, something involving legal documents, money transfers, and a secret financial account that had been opened in my name when I was only 16 years old. An account I had never seen. An account that, according to public records, had recently been emptied for exactly $78, 436.52. And the transaction date, 2 weeks before Melissa posted that viral video. 3 weeks before my 29th birthday, on a rainy Tuesday at 2:06 p.m., I received a certified letter stamped from Multnomah County Financial Compliance Services stating that an account under my Social Security number had been flagged after a withdrawal of $78, 436.52. I didn't recognize the bank. I didn't recognize the account number, but the signature authorization attached to the notice had my name on it. Evelyn Grace Whitmore, signed in blue ink, dated March 14th. I was in a client strategy meeting in downtown Portland when I opened that letter. There were 6 people around the conference table discussing a $420,000 annual contract. And I remember staring at the page while someone asked me about ad performance metrics. I didn't answer because my hands had gone completely cold. Not shaking, just cold. If you've ever had a moment where your entire life suddenly feels like it's sliding out from under you, you know what I mean? It's not panic at first. It's disbelief, like your brain refuses to connect the dots because the picture they form is too ugly to accept. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my car in silence. I didn't call the number listed on the letter immediately. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat for almost 20 minutes, staring at the rain hitting the windshield, because one thought kept repeating in my mind: no one opens a bank account under a minor's identity without a guardian. And there had only ever been one person legally authorized to sign financial documents for me when I was 16. My mother, Lorraine Whitmore. I finally called the compliance officer listed on the notice, a man named Daniel Carver, who spoke in the neutral procedural tone of someone who deals with identity fraud daily. He asked me a series of verification questions: date of birth, previous addresses, mother's maiden name. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Miss Whitmore, this account was opened in 2013 when you were listed as a dependent minor. The co-signer and legal guardian was Lorraine Whitmore. I didn't respond immediately. I just closed my eyes. Because in that exact moment, every strange comment my mother had ever made about money, every passive remark about family sacrifice, every guilt-laced conversation about how expensive it was to raise me, suddenly aligned into a pattern. Daniel continued, unaware of the storm building in my chest. The account had minimal activity for several years, he said. But over the past 18 months, there were regular transfers totaling approximately $92,000. The final withdrawal occurred 2 weeks ago and closed the account. $92,000, not 78, 92. I swallowed slowly. Who authorized the withdrawals? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then he said something very carefully. The signatures appear to match yours. However, there are irregularities that triggered the investigation. Irregularities. That word echoed in my head because it meant something very specific in financial compliance language. It meant someone suspected forgery or identity manipulation, or both. I remember staring at my reflection in the dark car window, feeling something shift inside me. Not shock anymore, not confusion, clarity. Because suddenly, the birthday video Melissa would later post, the rumors that had started spreading, the subtle attacks on my credibility, all made terrifying sense. If someone wanted to destroy me publicly, the most effective strategy wouldn't be to attack my personality. It would be to attack my integrity, to make me look financially dishonest, untrustworthy, criminal. And what better way to do that than by draining a secret account under my name, then accusing me of stealing from my own family? Daniel asked if I wanted to file an immediate fraud investigation. I told him no. He sounded surprised. Miss Whitmore, he said, this is a significant financial matter. You should— I understand, I interrupted calmly. I just need time to review documentation first. What I didn't tell him was this. I already knew who had done it, but knowing wasn't enough. Because confronting Lorraine Whitmore without proof would only trigger the exact reaction she had perfected over decades. Denial, deflection, victimhood. She would cry. She would say I was paranoid. She would tell relatives I was mentally unstable. And Melissa would back her up with that soft, sympathetic voice that made everyone instinctively trust her. I couldn't fight them emotionally. I had to fight them factually, and that required patience. So instead of filing the report, I did something else. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Natalie Brooks, a former IRS financial crimes analyst who specialized in family fraud cases. Her consultation fee was $450 an hour, and I paid for 10 hours up front without hesitation. During our first meeting, she listened silently while I explained everything: the hidden account, my family history, the recent rumors online. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer sympathy. She just took notes. Then she looked at me and said something that chilled me to the bone. This isn't just identity theft, she said quietly. This looks like a long-term financial grooming pattern. I frowned. What does that mean? She folded her hands. It means someone likely opened that account with the intention of using it strategically later, either to siphon money gradually or to create legal liability for you. Legal liability. I felt my chest tighten. You're saying this could be used against me? Natalie nodded. If someone drains an account in your name, then publicly claims you stole money from family, it creates a very convincing narrative. A narrative, not truth, just a story. And stories were exactly what my sister specialized in crafting. Natalie continued reviewing the documents in silence for several minutes before asking a question that caught me off guard. Has anyone close to you recently shown unusual interest in your financial success or expressed resentment about your public visibility? I thought of Melissa's live stream comment. I thought of my mother's warning about truth coming out. I thought of the anonymous rumors online. Yes, I said quietly. She nodded once, as if confirming a theory. Then she said, "If this is what I think it is, Miss Whitmore, this situation isn't over." I felt a slow chill spread down my spine. "What do you mean?" She met my eyes steadily. "I mean, whoever did this isn't just trying to take money." She paused. "They're trying to destroy your reputation." And that's when I realized something truly frightening. The financial fraud wasn't the end game. It was just the setup. Because 2 weeks later, on the night of my birthday, Melissa posted that viral video accusing me of stealing from our mother. And within 24 hours, a lawyer I had never met would send me a formal demand letter claiming I owed my family exactly $75,000 in misappropriated funds. But what terrified me most wasn't the accusation. It was the name printed at the bottom of that legal document. Because the attorney representing my mother was someone who had worked with my family long before I was old enough to understand what power really looked like. On the morning of October 14th at 8:32 a.m., exactly 9 hours after my sister's video passed 3 million views, I received a FedEx envelope marked "Legal Notice," demanding repayment of $75,000 within 30 days, or facing civil litigation for fraud and elder financial abuse. The letter was 8 pages long, precise, formal, cold. It claimed that over the past 2 years, I had illegally transferred funds from a family trust account intended for the care of Lorraine Whitmore. I read it twice before my eyes settled on the signature line at the bottom. Attorney Harold Vincent Keene. The name hit me like a distant echo from a childhood memory I hadn't accessed in years. Because Harold Keene wasn't just some random lawyer. He had been my mother's attorney for decades. He handled her divorce when I was 7. He helped draft my grandmother's estate documents when I was 12. He was practically a fixture at family gatherings, the quiet, gray-haired man who always wore navy suits and spoke in polite, measured sentences. And now he was formally accusing me of financial abuse. Not misunderstanding, not family conflict. Abuse? If you've ever been publicly labeled something you know you are not, you understand the strange, suffocating feeling that comes with it. It's not just about defending yourself. It's about realizing that once a word like that enters the public record, it never fully disappears. It stains, it follows, and worst of all, it forces you to fight on someone else's terms. I set the letter down on my kitchen counter and stared at it in silence. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Melissa. Just 4 words, maybe tell the truth. No greeting, no explanation, no fear, just calm certainty. Like she already knew exactly how this story would end. I didn't respond because at that moment, something inside me shifted permanently. It wasn't anger. It wasn't panic. It was clarity so sharp, it almost felt peaceful. They weren't just trying to hurt me emotionally. They were trying to create a legal narrative that would make their lies official, which meant they had already planned this for a long time. Long before that birthday video, long before the rumors online. This had been building quietly for years. And suddenly, Natalie Brooks's words echoed in my mind. Long-term financial grooming pattern. I picked up the legal letter again and read it more carefully. That's when I noticed something specific. The accusation wasn't vague. It referenced exact transaction dates, exact amounts, exact transfer methods, all documented, which meant one thing: someone had created a paper trail designed to look legitimate. But there was a problem with that plan. Paper trails can be analyzed, and fake ones always leave inconsistencies. I called Natalie immediately. She answered on the second ring. "I was expecting your call," she said calmly. "I just received a legal demand letter," I told her. "I know," she replied. I froze, you know. "Yes," she said, "because I received a notification this morning that someone attempted to access archived financial records connected to your identity." A cold chill spread down my spine. "They're monitoring this," I whispered. "Yes," Natalie said quietly. which means this isn't reactive. It's coordinated. Coordinated. The word felt heavy in my chest because coordination meant planning, communication, strategy. This wasn't just my mother acting impulsively out of resentment, and it wasn't just Melissa stirring drama for attention. This was structured. Natalie asked me to scan and send the legal letter immediately. Within an hour, she called back. Her voice was different this time, tighter, more serious. "Evelyn," she said, "there's something very important you need to understand." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "What? The trust account they're claiming you stole from," she paused, "doesn't exist." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "What do you mean?" "I mean there is no registered trust under your mother's name that matches the legal description in that letter." Silence filled the line. My mind struggled to process the implications. "They fabricated it?" I asked. "Not exactly," Natalie said. "They referenced a real financial structure, but altered key details." My heart began to beat faster. "Why would they do that?" She answered with chilling precision. "Because it creates legal confusion. It forces you into a defensive position while they control the narrative. Control the narrative, just like Melissa's video, just like the anonymous rumors, just like every subtle emotional manipulation I had experienced growing up. But this time, it wasn't just psychological. It was legal, strategic, and extremely dangerous." Natalie continued. "This kind of tactic is usually used in one specific situation." I swallowed. "What situation?" "When someone is trying to discredit a high-visibility individual before a larger accusation or public exposure." A larger accusation. The words echoed in my head like distant thunder. Because suddenly, something clicked. Melissa's video hadn't just accused me of stealing money. It had framed me as morally dishonest, manipulative, fake. It had primed the public to believe anything negative about me that might come later, which meant this legal attack was only phase 2. And there was still a phase 3 I couldn't see yet. I asked Natalie the question that had been forming in my mind since the moment I read the lawyer's name. "Do you think Harold Keene knows this documentation is flawed?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I don't think someone with his experience would miss these inconsistencies." My stomach dropped. "So he's knowingly participating." Her voice was calm but firm. Yes, that single word changed everything. Because it meant this wasn't just family betrayal. It was institutional, legal, systemic. They weren't just trying to hurt me, emotionally or financially. They were trying to dismantle my credibility permanently. And suddenly, I remembered something from years ago, a conversation I overheard when I was 15. My mother had been speaking with Harold Keene in our living room, thinking I was upstairs. I heard her say one sentence that had confused me at the time. "If she ever turns against us, we need leverage." I hadn't understood what she meant back then. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with a fraudulent legal notice in front of me, I finally did. Leverage. That hidden bank account. The fabricated trust claim. The public smear campaign. It was all leverage, built slowly, quietly, over years. And at that exact moment, I realized something else. They weren't just trying to win. They believed they already had. Because they thought I didn't know the most dangerous part of their plan yet. A part that Natalie would uncover later, that afternoon, when she accessed archived tax filings connected to that secret account opened in my name at 16. Filings that showed someone had been reporting income under my identity for nearly a decade. 2 days after the legal notice arrived, at 6:48 a.m. on a Thursday morning, Natalie Brooks called me and said she had found tax filings under my Social Security number, reporting $312,000 in independent contractor income between 2015 and 2023, income I had never earned, never received, and never even known existed. I was still standing in my kitchen, barefoot, coffee untouched, when she said the number, $312,000. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. Because there was only one way something like that could happen without triggering immediate IRS alerts. The filings had to look legitimate, which meant someone had created fake contracts, fake 1099 forms, and possibly fake client identities tied to my name. And they had done it consistently for nearly 8 years. Natalie explained it in the calm, analytical tone she always used when describing financial crimes. Whoever did this wasn't sloppy, she said. They reported income at levels that wouldn't trigger automatic audits. They also reported partial taxes paid each year. Partial taxes? My stomach tightened, meaning I asked, meaning the IRS sees you as someone who earned money, but underpaid, taxes not someone whose identity was stolen. The words settled heavily in my chest, because I understood exactly what that meant. This wasn't just about draining a hidden account. It was about building a financial record that could eventually be used to accuse me of tax fraud. And in the United States, tax fraud isn't just a reputation problem. It's a criminal offense. Natalie continued. Based on these filings, if someone were to submit a formal complaint tomorrow, you could face an audit and potentially felony charges depending on interpretation. I leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of that reality press down on me. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I knew how systems work. Once an accusation enters legal channels, truth doesn't matter immediately. Documentation does. And right now, the documentation was not in my favor. Have you ever realized that someone has been quietly building a trap around you for years, and you only see it once the door is already closing? If you've ever felt that kind of slow, creeping betrayal, tell me in the comments. Because the worst part isn't the anger. It's the realization of how long they've been planning. I asked Natalie the question that had been burning in my mind since she first mentioned the tax filings. How could they file income under my name without me noticing? She answered without hesitation. They likely used a mailing address you didn't control. And suddenly, a memory surfaced. An address. My childhood home. The place I had left at 18 and never returned to except for brief holiday visits. For years, official documents tied to my early financial history would still have been routed there. And if my mother had intercepted them, she could have controlled every notification, every notice, every warning. Natalie confirmed my suspicion. All IRS correspondence related to those filings was sent to your mother's address until 2 years ago, she said. 2 years ago, right around the time my online presence had started growing rapidly. Right around the time I began appearing in media interviews about ethical digital branding. Right around the time I became visible enough that damaging me publicly would have real impact. A cold realization settled over me. They hadn't just been preparing for leverage. They had been waiting for the moment when I had the most to lose. Natalie then told me something else, something that made my chest tighten with a different kind of fear. Evelyn, there's evidence that some of the reported clients tied to this income are shell entities. I frowned. Shell entities. Yes, she said quietly. Companies that exist legally on paper but have no real operations. My mind raced. What does that mean for me? Her answer came slowly. It means someone wasn't just filing fake income. They were potentially laundering money through your identity. The word laundering hung in the air like a thundercloud, because that shifted everything. This wasn't just family manipulation anymore. It had crossed into serious federal territory. And suddenly, the scale of what my mother and sister might be involved in became terrifyingly clear. I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to steady my breathing. What do we do? I asked. Natalie didn't hesitate. We document everything, quietly. We don't confront anyone yet. Her tone sharpened slightly. Because if they're willing to fabricate financial records for years, they may escalate if they feel threatened. Escalate. The word sent a chill through me, because I knew exactly what escalation could look like in my family. Not physical violence, not dramatic explosions, Something far more insidious: public character assassination, legal accusations, social isolation. They didn't need to hurt me physically. They just needed to make the world stop trusting me. And they were already halfway there. By that afternoon, Melissa's birthday video had climbed to 3.7 million views. Influencer gossip pages were reposting clips. Comment sections were filled with strangers calling me a fraud, a narcissist, a fake activist. Some even referenced the exact dollar amount, $75,000, as if it were already proven fact. Which meant one thing: someone had leaked the legal narrative publicly before it was ever tested in court. And only two people had direct access to that story: my mother and Melissa. That evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing documents Natalie had compiled, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. When I answered, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and immediately recognizable. "Miss Whitmore? This is Harold Keene." My pulse slowed, not sped up, but slowed like ice settling over water. "I thought it might be helpful," he continued smoothly, "if we discussed a resolution before matters escalate further." His tone was polite, reasonable, as if we were negotiating a simple contract dispute, not confronting years of deception. "What kind of resolution?" I asked quietly. He paused just long enough to make his next words feel deliberate. "If you agree to publicly acknowledge financial misconduct and repay the disputed funds, my client is willing to avoid pursuing criminal complaints." Publicly acknowledge financial misconduct. The words were precise, legal, and devastating, because if I agreed, it wouldn't just end the conflict. It would permanently validate their narrative. I felt a strange calm settle inside me, the kind that comes when fear finally transforms into certainty. Because in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They weren't trying to prove the truth. They were trying to force a confession, not in a courtroom, but in public opinion. I spoke slowly, carefully. "Mr. Keene," I said, "before we discuss any resolution, I have one question." He waited. "Did you personally verify the authenticity of the financial documents your client provided?" There was a pause, longer than before, and in that silence, I heard something shift. Not guilt, not panic, something colder: calculation. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its warmth. "That won't be necessary if we reach an agreement." That answer told me everything. He knew. He knew the documentation was flawed, and he was still willing to use it. I ended the call without another word, because in that moment, a realization crystallized fully in my mind. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about exposing a system of deception that had been operating for years. And I knew exactly where to start. With the one person who had quietly enabled everything since the beginning: my mother's longtime accountant, a man named Victor Harlan, a man who, according to Natalie's newest findings, had been listed as the financial preparer on every suspicious tax filing under my name. On Monday morning at 10:11 a.m., exactly 4 days after Harold Keene demanded my public confession, I walked into a beige office building on Southwest Broadway and sat across from Victor Harlan, the accountant who had signed off on 8 years of tax filings under my identity. He looked exactly as I remembered from childhood: thin silver hair, wire-frame glasses, a posture so carefully neutral it almost felt rehearsed. The kind of man who blended into the background of every family gathering while quietly managing the financial lifelines no one else understood. When he saw me, his expression froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm what Natalie and I already suspected. He wasn't surprised to see me. He was worried. "Evelyn," he said cautiously, folding his hands on the desk, "I wasn't expecting you." His tone was polite, controlled, but beneath it, I could hear tension tightening his voice like a string pulled too taut. I didn't sit down immediately. I placed a thin folder on the desk instead. Inside were printed copies of the tax filings Natalie had uncovered, each page marked with red annotations, highlighting inconsistencies, shell company names, suspicious income patterns, forged digital signatures. "Were you expecting these?" I asked quietly. His eyes flicked down to the folder, then back to me. And for the first time in my life, I saw something crack through Victor Harlan's carefully composed demeanor. Fear. He didn't open the folder. He didn't deny anything. He just exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Not angrily, not defensively, almost wearily, like someone who had known this confrontation would eventually come. I finally sat down across from him. "Then, where should I be?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Far away from this situation." The words hung between us heavy with meaning, because they weren't a warning about legal consequences. They were a warning about something deeper, something more dangerous. If you've ever had someone tell you to walk away from a problem instead of facing it, you know what that moment feels like. It's not protective, it's revealing, because it means they know exactly how bad the truth really is. I leaned forward slightly. "Victor," I said calmly, "I need you to answer one question honestly." He didn't speak. He just watched me with tired eyes. "Did you knowingly file fraudulent income under my name?" Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels crowded with unspoken truths. Finally he spoke. "Yes." The word landed with shocking simplicity. No denial, no excuses, just quiet confirmation. My chest tightened, but my voice remained steady. "Why?" He looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. "Because I was instructed to." A cold chill spread through me. "Instructed by who?" His jaw clenched slightly. "You already know the answer to that." "My mother, Lorraine Whitmore." But I needed him to say it. "For the record, for reality, for clarity," I said softly, "I need you to state it." He closed his eyes briefly before whispering. "Your mother." Hearing it spoken aloud felt like something inside my chest finally snapping into place, not breaking, but locking into a cold, unmovable position. Because now there was no ambiguity left. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was fact, documented, confirmed. I asked the next question slowly. "When did this start?" Victor's voice dropped lower. "After your grandmother passed away." My breath caught. That was 12 years ago. I was only 17. "What happened after she died?" I asked. He hesitated again, clearly weighing something internally. Then he said, "She left you money." The words struck like a quiet explosion. I blinked. "What?" Victor met my eyes for the first time since I entered the office. "Your grandmother, Margaret Ellis Whitmore, left a discretionary inheritance for you in her will. Approximately $180,000. My mind reeled. I had never known about any inheritance, never received any documents, never heard a single mention of it. "Why was I never told?" I whispered. Victor swallowed. "Because your mother contested the terms privately and gained temporary control of the funds while you were still a minor." Temporary control. The phrase suddenly connected everything. The hidden bank account, the tax filings, the alleged trust claims. It all traced back to that original inheritance. My grandmother had tried to secure something for me, and my mother had turned it into a financial weapon instead. Victor continued quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "She didn't just use the funds," he said. "She structured financial activity under your name to justify the transfers." My hands clenched under the table. "So the fake income was to cover where the inheritance money went." He nodded slowly. "Yes." A wave of cold realization washed over me. This had never been about random fraud. It had been about hiding the misuse of my grandmother's legacy. For years, decades. And when I became successful and visible enough to question it, they shifted the narrative from concealment to accusation. They weren't just trying to steal from me. They were trying to frame me, I asked the question that had been sitting like ice in my throat. Why now? Victor's expression tightened. Because you became too visible, he said quietly. Your financial transparency advocacy, it made your mother nervous. Nervous? The word felt almost absurdly small compared to the scale of what she had done. But there's something else, he added. My stomach tightened. What? He hesitated before answering. 2 months ago, your mother asked me to prepare documentation supporting a claim that you had been financially exploiting her. The room felt suddenly smaller, colder. What kind of documentation? I asked. Victor's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Medical records. My heart skipped. Medical records, he nodded grimly. She intends to claim cognitive decline and accuse you of taking advantage of her mental condition. The words hit with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was a calculated plan to accuse me of elder abuse, a charge that could destroy not just my career, but my entire future. I felt my breathing slow as a strange, icy calm settled over me. Because in that moment, I understood something with absolute certainty. They had spent years constructing a narrative designed to trap me legally. But in doing so, they had also left a trail of evidence that could destroy them completely. Victor looked at me carefully, almost pleading. You need to walk away, he said quietly. You don't understand how far Lorraine is willing to go. I met his gaze without blinking. I think I do, I said softly, because I had just realized something he didn't know yet. Something Natalie had discovered late the night before. A detail buried in the financial records Victor himself had filed years ago. A detail that proved my mother hadn't just misused inheritance funds. She had done something far worse, something that could lead to federal charges. And the evidence of that crime was sitting in a safety deposit box registered under Victor Harlan's name. At 7:03 p.m. that same Monday, exactly 9 hours after Victor Harlan admitted my mother had manipulated my inheritance, Natalie called to tell me the safety deposit box, registered under his name, had been accessed 17 times over the past 3 years, always within 48 hours of large financial transfers tied to my identity. 17 visits, 17 opportunities to hide something important. Natalie's voice was quiet but firm. That box likely contains original documentation, she said. Not copies, not digital files. The real paper trail. Original documentation. The words settled into my chest like cold metal. Because in financial crime cases, original documents matter more than anything. Ink signatures, timestamps, physical records that cannot be altered retroactively. If those existed, it meant there was proof that couldn't be erased. But there was a problem. The safety deposit box wasn't under my name. It wasn't under my mother's name. It was registered solely to Victor Harlan, which meant legally I had no right to access it, not without his consent or a court order. And court orders took time my mother clearly didn't intend to give me. Because by that evening, her narrative was escalating fast. Melissa's birthday video had passed 4.1 million views. 2 mid-sized news blogs had published articles repeating the allegation that I had financially exploited my own mother. The legal demand letter had been quietly leaked online. And in the comments, strangers were already calling me a criminal, a thief, a fake advocate for transparency. The irony almost felt surreal. For years, I had built my reputation teaching brands how to protect their credibility during crises. Now, I was watching my own credibility dismantled in real time. Have you ever experienced a moment where your entire life's work feels like it's being erased overnight? Not because of something you did, but because someone else controlled the narrative first. If you've ever faced that kind of helplessness, tell me in the comments. Because what happened next was the moment I realized helplessness was exactly what they were counting on. Natalie and I met in person that night to review strategy. She spread printed financial timelines across her conference table charts, mapping every suspicious transaction tied to my identity over the past decade. Looking at it all laid out together was overwhelming. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. Each financial move aligned perfectly with major life events in my timeline. When I left for college, when I started my business, when my public visibility began increasing, every step of my independence was mirrored by financial activity under my name that I had never authorized. Natalie traced one finger along a series of transactions clustered around a specific year. Here, she said, this is when the pattern intensified. I leaned closer. The date range stopped my breath. The year my social media following jumped from 40,000 to nearly 1 million. The year my first national brand campaign went viral. The year I became publicly recognizable. They weren't just hiding money, Natalie said quietly. They were preparing a counter-narrative in case you ever gained enough power to question them. Counter-narrative. The phrase made everything snap into focus with terrifying clarity. They had anticipated a future conflict, and they had built a financial story designed to discredit me if that conflict ever happened. But there was something even more disturbing. Natalie pointed to a set of transfers linked to shell companies. These entities didn't just move funds, she said. Some of them appear connected to political donor networks in private consulting contracts. I frowned. What does that mean? Her expression tightened. It means your identity may have been used in financial activity far outside family matters. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Are you saying this goes beyond my mother? Natalie didn't answer immediately. Then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. I'm saying Victor Harlan didn't operate alone. Silence filled the room. Because that possibility changed everything. This wasn't just family betrayal anymore. It wasn't just legal manipulation. It was potentially part of a broader financial scheme. And suddenly, Victor's earlier warning echoed in my mind. You don't understand how far Lorraine is willing to go. I had assumed he meant emotional cruelty or legal aggression. Now I realized he might have meant something much larger. I asked Natalie the question, pressing hardest against my thoughts. What's our next move? She didn't hesitate. We need access to that safety deposit box. But we can't legally get it yet, I said. Her eyes met mine steadily. Not officially, she replied. The implication hung between us, because there was one way to access that box without a court order. If Victor himself agreed to open it, which meant I needed to convince him to cooperate. But there was a risk. If he warned my mother first, she could remove or destroy the contents before we ever saw them. So timing would be critical. Natalie leaned forward slightly. You need to understand something, she said quietly. Victor is afraid. That means he's vulnerable. I nodded slowly. I saw that. But fear can push people in two directions, she continued. Toward cooperation or toward self-preservation. Self-preservation, meaning he might protect himself by protecting my mother, even if it meant sacrificing me. The next 24 hours would determine which direction he chose. That night, I barely slept, not because of anxiety, but because of a growing sense of inevitability. For the first time since this began, I no longer felt trapped. I felt patient, because I understood something my mother didn't. The longer she pushed her narrative publicly, the more committed she became to a version of reality that could eventually collapse under evidence. And she had just taken a major step in that direction. At 9:14 a.m. the next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. Melissa had posted a new video. In it, she wasn't crying anymore. She was calm, composed, and she was holding what she claimed were printed bank statements, showing transfers from my mother's trust account into an account under my name. The comments exploded instantly. People were calling it proof. Case closed. But as I watched the video carefully, I noticed something specific, something subtle, something most viewers would never catch. One of the account numbers printed on those documents matched a shell company Natalie had flagged the night before. a company that had no legal connection to me whatsoever, which meant Melissa had just publicly displayed fabricated financial evidence. And in doing so, she had unknowingly exposed a direct link to the hidden network of transactions Natalie was investigating. But what none of them knew yet, not my mother, not Melissa, not even Victor, was that someone else had already contacted Natalie early that morning. Someone who claimed to have inside knowledge of the safety deposit box contents, and who was willing to talk in exchange for one very specific condition. At 6:22 a.m. the morning after Melissa posted the bank statement video, Natalie texted me a single sentence. "He's willing to talk, but only if you promise not to involve law enforcement for 72 hours. No greeting, no explanation, just that." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something inside me settle into a strange, heavy stillness. Because I already knew who he had to be. Victor Harlan. There was no one else close enough to the financial structure and frightened enough to demand protection. I called Natalie immediately. "He reached out to you?" I asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "Around 5:40 this morning." He sounded shaken. Shaken. That word didn't surprise me, because the moment Melissa publicly displayed those fabricated financial documents, she had crossed a line that made everything far more dangerous. Not just legally, personally. Anyone involved in that network of falsified records now had exposure. Real exposure. And people who operate in quiet financial manipulation fear exposure more than anything else. Natalie continued. "He says he wants to meet in person, somewhere neutral." I exhaled slowly. "What's the condition exactly?" Her answer came with careful precision. "He wants your written assurance that you won't file a fraud report or contact federal authorities for at least 3 days. 3 days, 72 hours, long enough for someone to prepare or disappear." I walked to my window, watching the gray Portland morning settle over the city. My first instinct wasn't suspicion. It was calculation, because this wasn't just about what Victor wanted. It was about what his fear revealed. And fear, in situations like this, always meant one thing. Something had changed. Something he hadn't anticipated. Have you ever noticed how the most controlled people only panic when they realize they've lost control? Not when they're exposed. Not when they're confronted. But when they understand the narrative is no longer theirs to manage. If you've seen that shift in someone before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because that was the shift happening now. I asked Natalie the question that mattered most. "Do you believe him?" She paused before answering. "I believe he's scared," she said. "But I don't believe he's suddenly altruistic." That distinction mattered a lot. Because scared people don't necessarily tell the truth. They tell whatever protects them. But sometimes, protecting themselves requires revealing the truth anyway. I agreed to the meeting, not because I trusted Victor, but because I understood something he didn't realize yet. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing. The meeting was set for that afternoon at a quiet cafe near the Willamette River, one of those places where business conversations blend into background noise and no one pays attention to anyone else. Victor arrived exactly on time, but he looked different from the composed man I had seen in his office just 2 days earlier. His posture was tighter. His hands trembled slightly when he sat down, and there were deep shadows under his eyes, like someone who hadn't slept at all. He didn't order coffee. He didn't make small talk. He just leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." The same sentence he had said before, but this time it sounded less like a warning and more like a confession. I didn't interrupt. I just waited, because silence has always been my most effective tool with people like Victor. Eventually he continued. "Your mother isn't just trying to protect herself financially," he said quietly. "She's trying to protect someone else." A cold tension tightened in my chest. "Who?" I asked. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the exact moment he weighed whether to cross a line he had never crossed before. Then he whispered, "Melissa." The word hung in the air like something fragile. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Victor exhaled slowly, as if releasing years of pressure. "Most of the shell entities tied to those transactions weren't created by your mother." My pulse slowed, not sped up, but slowed, in that cold, controlled way it always did when something serious clicked into place. "Then who created them?" He looked directly at me. "Your sister." For a moment, the world around me seemed to narrow into a sharp, quiet focus, because this changed the entire structure of what I thought I understood. I had always seen Melissa as the emotional manipulator, the public storyteller, the soft-voiced performer. But this suggested something far more calculated, far more dangerous. "How?" I asked quietly. Victor swallowed. "She studied digital marketing, analytics, corporate structuring, online financial compliance loopholes." My mind flashed back to Melissa's college years, her constant fascination with online monetization systems, her obsession with influencer revenue streams, the late nights she spent learning about digital platform payment structures. At the time, I thought she was just interested in social media careers. Now I realized she had been studying something much more specific. Victor continued, his voice dropping lower. "She approached your mother years ago with a plan to maximize unused assets." Maximize unused assets. The phrase made my stomach turn because I knew exactly what it meant. She had seen my inheritance not as a family resource, but as an opportunity. Victor's next words landed like ice. "Your mother didn't understand the complexity of the system. Melissa did." Silence settled between us, because suddenly, the power dynamic I had always believed existed in our family shifted completely. Lorraine Whitmore wasn't the mastermind. She was the enabler, the emotional shield, the one who could publicly play the victim. But Melissa had built the structure, the shell companies, the financial layering, the narrative manipulation, everything. I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since he said her name. "Why frame me now?" Victor answered immediately. "Because you became a threat." The simplicity of the response made it more chilling. "You weren't supposed to gain this much public influence," he said. "Your advocacy for financial transparency, it risked exposing inconsistencies in the long-term records they had assumed I would never examine, because they believed I trusted them, or worse, that I would remain too emotionally conditioned to question them at all." Victor leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else in the safety deposit box," he said. Something in his tone made my chest tighten. "What?" He hesitated one final time before answering. "Original documentation proving Melissa directly authorized financial transfers under your identity." My breath stilled. Direct authorization, not indirect, not implied, signed, documented, legal evidence. And suddenly, everything became crystal clear. This wasn't just about protecting stolen money anymore. It was about preventing criminal liability. Because if that documentation surfaced publicly, Melissa wouldn't just lose credibility. She could face federal charges. Victor leaned back slowly. "That's why they're escalating so aggressively now," he said quietly. "They believe if they destroy your reputation first, no one will believe you when the truth comes out." I sat there in silence, absorbing the full weight of what he had just revealed. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, not anger, control. Because now I understood something they didn't. They believed I was still reacting emotionally, still defending myself, still trying to survive their narrative. They didn't realize I had already shifted into something far more dangerous. I had stopped fighting publicly and started preparing quietly. But Victor's final words before leaving that cafe introduced a new uncertainty I hadn't anticipated. Because as he stood up, he looked at me with genuine concern and said, "There's one document in that box even I haven't seen." I felt a cold tension ripple through me. "What document?" He hesitated. Then answered in a whisper. A notarized letter your grandmother left, with specific instructions to be opened only if financial disputes involving you ever occurred. At 11:58 p.m. that night, exactly 6 hours after Victor revealed the existence of my grandmother's sealed letter, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at a legal pad where I had written one sentence over and over in different ways. Silence is not weakness, it's strategy. Because for the first time since this began, I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't just a battle over truth. It was a battle over timing. And right now, timing was finally on my side. Victor had agreed to open the safety deposit box in 48 hours. Not immediately. He insisted on waiting until Friday afternoon at exactly 2:30 p.m. when the bank's private records supervisor, someone he trusted, would be on duty. He said it would ensure proper documentation. But Natalie and I both knew the real reason. He was buying time to protect himself, and possibly to warn my mother, which meant those 48 hours weren't just waiting time. They were preparation time. The next 2 days would determine whether this ended in quiet resolution or public destruction, and I knew exactly which direction my mother and sister were pushing toward. Because the morning after my meeting with Victor, Melissa posted another video. This time, she didn't cry. She smiled, calm, confident, dangerously composed. She spoke slowly, like someone delivering a rehearsed statement. I didn't want to share this, she told her viewers, but my mother deserves protection. Then she held up what she claimed were printed medical reports, documents showing Lorraine Whitmore had been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment 6 months earlier, and that she had been vulnerable to financial exploitation. The comment section exploded. Within minutes, the narrative shifted from suspicion to certainty. People weren't just calling me dishonest anymore. They were calling me abusive, predatory. Someone even wrote she took advantage of her own sick mother. That's unforgivable. I watched the video once, then turned my phone face down on the table, because reacting emotionally would only play into exactly what they wanted. Instead, I focused on something else, patterns. Because Melissa's biggest weakness had always been this: she believed narrative control mattered more than factual precision. She prioritized emotional impact over technical accuracy, and that meant every time she escalated publicly, she risked making mistakes. Natalie called me that afternoon with a tone of restrained urgency. The medical documentation Melissa posted isn't legitimate, she said immediately. I felt my chest tighten slightly, not with surprise, but with confirmation. What's wrong with it? I asked. The clinic name listed doesn't provide cognitive impairment evaluations, she explained, and the physician's license number belongs to a retired practitioner. A retired practitioner, meaning the document wasn't just misleading. It was fabricated, and Melissa had displayed it publicly to millions of viewers, which meant she had just crossed from narrative manipulation into document falsification, a legal boundary far more dangerous than defamation. But I still didn't react publicly. I didn't post. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even respond to the thousands of messages flooding my inbox. Instead, I did something that confused everyone watching. I went silent, completely silent, for 48 hours. No posts, no statements, no engagement. And that silence began to create something unexpected: doubt. Because the internet runs on reaction cycles. Accusation, response, escalation. When one side refuses to react, the cycle stalls. Speculation grows. Some viewers began commenting, "Why isn't Evelyn responding? Is she preparing a legal case? Something feels off about this situation." Silence became pressure. Not on me, on them. Have you ever noticed how people who rely on controlling the narrative become unstable when they can't provoke a reaction? They escalate faster, make riskier moves, reveal more than they intend. That's exactly what Melissa did next. On Thursday night, less than 12 hours before the scheduled safety deposit box opening, she went live unexpectedly. This time, she wasn't calm. She was agitated, her voice tighter than usual, her speech slightly rushed. And she said something that made my entire body go still. "We have proof that Evelyn planned to steal from our family for years," she told viewers. "There are documents she's been hiding." Documents she's been hiding. The statement was so specific, so strangely timed, that it revealed something she probably hadn't intended to expose. She knew about the safety deposit box, which meant Victor had warned them, or someone else had. But here's what Melissa didn't realize. In that moment, by claiming I was hiding documents, she publicly established that such documents existed and that they mattered. That single statement would later become legally significant because it proved prior knowledge, intent, and awareness of evidence. Natalie called me immediately after the live stream ended. "They're panicking," she said. "Yes," I replied quietly. "And panic makes people sloppy." She exhaled slowly. Tomorrow changes everything, she said. I looked out my apartment window at the dark river reflecting scattered city lights. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt steady because I knew something my mother and sister still didn't understand. This was no longer a battle of narratives. It was about to become a battle of documented truth. And truth doesn't shout. It waits. Friday afternoon at 2:30 p.m., we would open that safety deposit box. Inside would be original financial records, authorization documents, proof of identity, misuse, and my grandmother's sealed letter. But there was one detail none of us knew yet. Not me, not Natalie, not even Victor. Because early that morning, before the bank opened, someone else had attempted to access the safety deposit box. And when the bank manager refused entry without Victor present, that person had left behind something unexpected, a handwritten note addressed directly to me at 2:27 p.m. on Friday. 3 minutes before the bank's private vault door opened, the branch manager handed me a folded, cream-colored envelope that had been left behind that morning at 8:12 a.m. by someone who refused to give their name. My name was written across the front in blue ink, Evelyn Grace Whitmore. The handwriting was familiar, not from recent years, from childhood, from birthday cards, from school permission slips, from notes left on the kitchen counter when I was growing up. It was my mother's handwriting, Lorraine Whitmore. For a moment, I didn't open it. I just held it between my fingers, feeling the weight of something far heavier than paper pressing against my chest. Because this wasn't her usual style. She never wrote emotional letters. She preferred controlled conversations, carefully phrased statements, subtle psychological pressure. A handwritten note meant something had shifted, something she couldn't manage through legal channels or public narratives anymore. Natalie stood beside me, watching quietly. Victor waited a few feet away near the vault entrance, his posture rigid, with visible tension. "Do you want to read it now?" Natalie asked softly. I shook my head once. After I said, because whatever was inside that envelope, I needed to see the truth first. The unfiltered truth stored in that safety deposit box. Not her version of it, not her interpretation, just facts. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the vault door opened. The air inside smelled faintly metallic sterile, like a place designed to preserve secrets rather than money. The safety deposit box itself was smaller than I expected. Matte steel, unremarkable, labeled with a simple engraved number. No sign of the chaos it contained. Victor inserted his key with a slight tremor in his hand. The bank supervisor inserted hers. The lock clicked open with a soft, almost anticlimactic sound. But in that quiet moment, I felt something inside me shift permanently. Because this was no longer about suspicion, or fear, or preparation. This was the moment where truth either existed or didn't. Victor pulled the box out slowly and set it on the table inside the private viewing room. He stepped back immediately, like he didn't want to be physically close to what was inside. Natalie nodded toward it. "Go ahead," she said. My hands felt steady as I lifted the lid. Inside were 3 thick folders, a sealed envelope stamped with a notary seal, and a small USB drive. The first folder contained exactly what Victor had described: original tax filings, physical copies of 1099 forms, financial authorization documents, each page bearing unmistakable ink signatures. Some of them, my name, forged, meticulously, convincingly, but not perfectly, because the original documents included authentication stamps showing they had been submitted through Victor's firm. And beside those stamps were the initials of the person who authorized the submissions, M.W. Melissa Whitmore. Seeing those initials repeated across multiple years, across dozens of documents, felt surreal. Not shocking, not painful, just clarifying. Because there it was, undeniable, concrete, not emotional betrayal, not narrative manipulation, just evidence. Cold, precise, legally devastating. Natalie quietly photographed each page while I moved to the second folder. This one contained something different. Corporate registration documents, shell company formation records, email correspondence printouts, and then one specific document that made my breath catch: a notarized authorization letter signed by Melissa, explicitly granting permission for financial transfers using my identity for family asset management purposes. The notary stamp was dated 7 years earlier, meaning she had planned this long before any public conflict, long before my online success. This had never been reactive. It had been intentional from the beginning. I felt a calm, heavy certainty settle inside me, because now there was no doubt left, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, just truth, documented, recorded, verifiable. I set that folder aside and picked up the third. This one contained something unexpected: printed emails between Victor and Harold Keene, legal discussions about risk mitigation strategies, conversations about preparing a defensive narrative in case of future disputes, and one particular email chain from 2 years earlier where Harold Keene wrote a sentence that made my chest tighten with cold clarity. If Evelyn's public profile continues to grow, we must accelerate contingency planning. Contingency planning, meaning they had anticipated this moment long before it happened. They had expected conflict, prepared for it, and built a legal strategy around it. I closed the folder slowly, because now there was only one item left: the sealed envelope, my grandmother's letter. The notary seal was dated 11 years ago, just weeks before she passed away. My fingers hesitated for only a second before breaking the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter on thick cream paper. Her handwriting was elegant, steady, unmistakable. I read it silently at first, then once more, because the weight of her words needed to settle fully before I could even process them. She wrote that she had intentionally structured my inheritance to bypass direct control from my mother, because she had long suspected Lorraine's financial opportunism. She wrote that she trusted me to use the funds independently when I came of age. And then she wrote something that changed everything. She had anticipated that if her instructions were ignored, evidence would eventually be necessary. So she had arranged something else, something separate from the financial records. A legal safeguard, one that would only be revealed under one specific condition: if a family member attempted to accuse me of financial wrongdoing. I felt my pulse slow into that cold, focused rhythm I had come to recognize over the past weeks. Because at that moment, I understood something profound. My grandmother hadn't just protected me financially. She had prepared for the exact scenario now unfolding. And the final paragraph of her letter made my hands go completely still. Because she wrote that the safeguard she created was not stored in the safety deposit box. It was held by someone else, someone completely outside the family, a legal custodian, with instructions to release it publicly only after I formally denied any wrongdoing in a recorded setting, which meant one thing: the moment I publicly defended myself, a second, far more powerful piece of evidence would automatically surface. But what terrified me most wasn't the existence of that safeguard. It was the name of the person holding it. Because it wasn't a lawyer or a financial institution. It was someone far more unexpected. Someone whose involvement meant this situation was about to become very public, very quickly, and very impossible for my mother and sister to control. On the morning of November 2nd, at exactly 10:00 a.m., I walked onto a stage in front of 412 attendees at the Pacific Northwest Digital Ethics Summit, a conference where I had been scheduled for months to deliver a keynote on transparency, accountability, and reputation in the online economy. It was the largest public event I had appeared at since Melissa's accusations went viral. By then, her videos had surpassed 6.3 million total views. My name had been trending in niche influencer watchdog communities for 3 consecutive weeks, and most people in that room already believed they knew what kind of person I was. A fraud, a manipulator, someone who had exploited her own mother. I could feel it in the way the audience watched me when I stepped onto the stage. Curiosity, judgment, anticipation. Because everyone expected one of 2 things, either a desperate denial or an emotional breakdown. Instead, I did neither. I adjusted the microphone calmly and began with a single sentence. My name is Evelyn Grace Whitmore, and today I am here to publicly deny every allegation of financial misconduct made against me. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Phones lifted immediately, recording, streaming, capturing every word, because they all sensed this moment mattered, not just for my career, but for the narrative that had dominated the past month. I continued in a steady, controlled voice. For the past 12 years, my identity has been used, without my knowledge, in a series of financial transactions, tax filings, and corporate registrations that I did not authorize. I paused, not for effect, but to allow the weight of that statement to settle. Then I said the words that triggered everything my grandmother had prepared for. I have never stolen from my family. I have never exploited my mother, and I will be presenting documented evidence to support that truth. In that exact moment, somewhere else in Portland, a sealed legal directive activated automatically. Because within 30 seconds of those words being spoken publicly, Natalie's phone vibrated. She was seated in the front row, exactly where we had planned. Her eyes dropped briefly to the screen. Then she looked up at me and nodded once. The signal was subtle, but it told me everything. The safeguard had been triggered. My grandmother's contingency plan was now in motion. I continued speaking calmly, shifting from personal statements to verifiable facts. I explained the hidden bank account opened when I was a minor, the forged tax filings, the shell companies, the documented authorization signatures, each claim supported by evidence displayed on the large projection screen behind me. Natalie had prepared the visual timeline meticulously. Transaction dates, financial flows, legal inconsistencies, everything presented clearly, objectively, without emotional language, because facts don't need dramatics. They just need visibility. As the audience absorbed the information, I could see the shift happening in real time. The tension in the room changed, from skepticism to confusion, then slowly to realization, because documentation carries a different weight than accusations. It doesn't demand belief, it demands examination. Halfway through my presentation, I displayed the most critical document, the notarized authorization letter, signed by Melissa Whitmore, her full name, her signature, her explicit permission for financial transfers, using my identity. The room fell into complete silence, a silence so heavy it almost felt physical. Because in that moment, the narrative collapsed, not emotionally, but structurally. There was no interpretation left, no ambiguity, just documented truth. And then Natalie stood up from the front row. She didn't interrupt. She simply walked to the stage and handed me a sealed envelope, cream-colored, stamped with an official seal from a private legal custodial service. The safeguard, the final layer my grandmother had prepared. I opened it carefully in full view of the audience. Inside was a notarized affidavit, signed by a retired federal financial crimes investigator named Thomas R. Callahan, a man who, according to the document, had been hired by my grandmother 11 years earlier to conduct an independent audit of her estate assets. And what he found changed everything, because his investigation concluded that Lorraine Whitmore had already begun misappropriating funds years before my grandmother passed away. But more importantly, he documented that Melissa Whitmore had been directly involved in structuring financial concealment strategies, including identity layering techniques designed to shift liability onto another family member, me. The affidavit included verified financial tracing reports, expert forensic analysis, and sworn testimony establishing a clear timeline of intent, not accidental misuse, not misunderstanding, deliberate financial manipulation. The audience sat frozen as I read the final paragraph aloud. This affidavit confirms that Evelyn Grace Whitmore was not only uninvolved in the financial misconduct examined, but was deliberately positioned as a future liability shield by Lorraine Whitmore and Melissa Whitmore. The words hung in the air like a final verdict, because that was exactly what they were. Not opinion, not narrative, legal fact. And at that exact moment, something else happened. In the back of the conference hall, two people stood up abruptly. Lorraine Whitmore and Melissa Whitmore. They had arrived quietly during the presentation, hoping to observe without being noticed. But now, they could no longer remain invisible, because every eye in the room turned toward them. Every phone camera pivoted instantly. And for the first time since this began, they were no longer controlling the narrative. They were trapped inside it. Lorraine's face had gone pale, her posture rigid, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear. Melissa's composure fractured faster. Her lips parted slightly. Her hands trembled. And when she realized the affidavit included her name, she whispered something under her breath that only the people closest to her could hear. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. That single sentence revealed everything. Because it wasn't a denial. It wasn't outrage. It was shock. The shock of someone who believed their plan was airtight, only to realize it had been anticipated years in advance. I didn't point at them. I didn't accuse them. I didn't even acknowledge them directly, because I didn't need to. The evidence had already done what emotion never could. It had removed their ability to deny reality. And yet, the confrontation wasn't over, because as security staff began moving toward them due to the growing commotion, Melissa suddenly stepped forward, her voice sharp, desperate, and loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You don't understand," she said. "There's more to this than she's telling you." The room fell silent again. Every camera focused on her, and in that moment, she made a choice that would determine everything that happened next. Because instead of staying silent, instead of walking away, she decided to speak. At 10:47 a.m., less than 15 minutes after my sister shouted that there was more to the story, Melissa Whitmore stepped fully into the center aisle of the conference hall, raised her voice, and said something that shattered whatever control she had left. She knew, Melissa said, pointing directly at me. She knew about the money years ago and stayed quiet because she benefited from it. The accusation hit the room like a sudden drop in temperature, not because it sounded convincing, but because it was clearly desperate. There's a moment in every public confrontation where the balance shifts irreversibly. Not when evidence is presented, not when accusations are made, but when the person losing control starts contradicting their own narrative. And Melissa had just crossed that line, because for weeks, her entire claim had been that I secretly stole from our mother. Now suddenly, she was saying I had known about the money all along. Those two statements couldn't coexist, and the audience understood that instantly. You could feel it in the way the room's energy shifted, from tense curiosity to quiet recognition. This wasn't truth fighting truth. This was someone unraveling in real time. Lorraine Whitmore tried to grab Melissa's arm, whispering something urgently, but Melissa shook her off sharply. Her composure so carefully maintained in every video, every interview, every public appearance, was collapsing piece by piece. She turned toward the audience, voice rising. She built her whole career pretending to care about honesty, she said, her tone cracking. But she's always been calculating. Always. Even as a child. The words hung awkwardly in the air. Because they weren't evidence. They weren't facts. They were emotional accusations, raw, unfocused, and increasingly disconnected from the documented reality projected behind me on the screen. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't react. I simply stood there in silence, because silence in that moment did something more powerful than any rebuttal could. It forced her to fill the void. And the more she spoke, the more the contradictions piled up. You don't understand, she continued, turning back toward the crowd. We did this for the family. We had to protect assets. We had to manage things she wasn't mature enough to handle. There it was, the first crack of admission. Not a denial, a justification. Natalie leaned slightly toward the microphone stand near the stage and said quietly, but clearly enough to carry across the room. Are you acknowledging you authorized financial transactions using Evelyn's identity? Melissa froze. For a split second, the room went completely still, because now the confrontation had shifted from emotional chaos to a direct legal question. And everyone knew it. Melissa's eyes darted toward my mother. Lorraine shook her head sharply. Tiny, frantic movements meant to signal silence. But Melissa was already too far inside her own spiral. I had to, she snapped. Someone had to fix the mess Grandma left. It wasn't illegal. It was just restructuring. A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the audience because that single sentence crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It wasn't a denial. It was a rationalization. And rationalization in legal contexts often carries more weight than outright confession. Lorraine's reaction was immediate. She stepped forward, abruptly, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. That's not what happened, she said sharply. You're misunderstanding everything. The classic shift, denial, then deflection. Exactly the pattern Natalie had predicted weeks earlier. Melissa turned toward her, eyes blazing. No, Mom, she said, her voice breaking. You told me to handle it. You said it would never come back on us if we structured it properly. The room went silent again. This time, not with tension, with clarity, because now the blame cycle had begun. The second stage of collapse. Lorraine's face flushed deep red. I never told you to do anything illegal, she insisted, her voice tightening. You're twisting my words. Melissa laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed uncomfortably in the quiet hall. You always do that, she said bitterly. You push responsibility onto someone else and pretend you were just trying to help. The dynamic was unmistakable now. Victimhood. The third stage. Lorraine's expression shifted instantly from defensive anger to wounded fragility. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned toward the audience. I'm an old woman, she said softly, her voice trembling. I trusted my children. I never imagined they would turn against each other like this. It was a familiar performance, one I had seen my entire life. But now, in this context, with documented evidence displayed behind me, it no longer held the same power, because the audience could see the pattern unfolding in real time. Denial, blame, victimhood, exactly as predicted. And then the final stage arrived. Collapse. It happened quietly, not dramatically, not with shouting or tears, but with something far more revealing. Melissa's shoulders sagged, her voice dropped, and she said one simple sentence that sealed everything. I didn't think it would go this far. Not a denial, not an accusation, just a statement of regret. And in that moment, the entire narrative structure they had built over years disintegrated completely. Because regret implies knowledge, and knowledge implies intent. I stepped forward to the microphone for the first time since she began speaking. Not to attack, not to accuse, just to state one final fact. For 12 years, I said calmly, I stayed silent because I believed family meant trust. Today, I'm choosing clarity instead. I paused, letting the quiet settle fully. Then, added in a steady voice, silence protects lies. Truth protects boundaries. That sentence would later be clipped into thousands of short videos across social platforms. But in that room, it wasn't viral. It was final, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reveal, nothing left to defend. Security staff approached gently, but firmly, guiding Lorraine and Melissa toward the exit. As media representatives and conference organizers stepped in to manage the growing attention. Neither of them resisted. Neither of them spoke again, because they knew it was over. Or at least, the public confrontation was. But as I stepped down from the stage and Natalie handed me my phone, she whispered something that made my chest tighten slightly. Federal investigators contacted me during the presentation, she said quietly. I looked at her. What do they want? Her answer came in a calm, measured tone. They want to know whether you're willing to provide formal testimony. Because while the public narrative had just ended, the legal consequences of everything that had been exposed were only beginning. 3 months later, on a quiet February morning at 7:05 a.m., I stood alone on a wooden dock along the Columbia River, holding a certified letter that confirmed federal prosecutors had formally charged Melissa Whitmore with identity fraud, financial falsification, and conspiracy to commit tax-related offenses. The letter was exactly 6 pages long, precise, neutral, clinical in tone. It didn't mention betrayal. It didn't mention family. It didn't mention the years of emotional manipulation that had led to this moment. It simply documented facts, dates, transactions, charges. Because in the end, karma rarely looks dramatic. It looks administrative. I folded the letter slowly and slipped it back into its envelope. Not because I needed to hide it, but because I didn't feel the need to hold it anymore. The investigation had moved forward steadily after the conference confrontation. Once federal authorities reviewed the documentation, Natalie and I provided the original filings. The shell company records the notarized authorization letters. The legal outcome became almost inevitable. Melissa had initially tried to deny everything. Then she claimed misunderstanding. Then she argued she had only followed guidance from others. The same pattern: denial, blame, victimhood. But unlike a family argument, legal systems don't respond to emotional narratives. They respond to evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Lorraine Whitmore was not criminally charged. Her involvement was classified as negligent facilitation rather than direct orchestration. But the legal consequences still found her in other ways: civil liability, financial restitution orders, asset freezes. Within 2 months, she had quietly sold the house I grew up in. The same house where silence had once been my survival strategy. The same house where love had always felt conditional. I didn't attend the closing. I didn't visit. I didn't drive past it. Because closure doesn't always require revisiting the place where pain started. Sometimes, closure is simply the ability to walk forward without looking back. Have you ever realized that the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer? It's removing their ability to control your peace. If you've ever reached that kind of quiet freedom, you know exactly what I mean. Because that was the real ending of this story. Not the legal verdict, not the public vindication, but the moment I stopped carrying the emotional weight of their actions. I eventually provided formal testimony during the federal case, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but because truth once exposed carries responsibility. And responsibility sometimes requires speaking clearly, even when it's uncomfortable. Melissa accepted a plea agreement 9 weeks after charges were filed. The sentence included financial restitution, supervised release, and permanent restrictions on managing financial accounts for others. The headlines lasted less than 2 weeks. Then, the internet moved on. Because the internet always moves on. But real healing doesn't follow the same timeline as public attention. It moves quietly, gradually, in small, ordinary moments. Like standing on a river dock on a cold morning, watching sunlight break across the water, realizing your life finally belongs entirely to you. A month after the legal process concluded, I received one last letter. Not from a lawyer, not from investigators, from my grandmother's legal custodian. It contained a simple statement confirming that the final safeguard she had established had been fully executed and that all protective directives were now closed permanently. There was also a handwritten note attached, in delicate, familiar script. My dear Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means truth has already found its way forward. Remember this. You were never meant to fight for approval. You were meant to live with clarity. I read that note several times before placing it in a small wooden box on my desk. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of something far more important. Boundaries. Because the real lesson of everything that happened wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about exposure. It was about understanding that family ties do not override personal integrity. And that silence, when chosen wisely, can be a form of strength rather than weakness. Today, my life looks calm, not perfect, not dramatic, just steady. My work continues. My audience returned, not all at once, but gradually, as clarity replaced speculation. Trust rebuilt slowly, organically, because real credibility isn't restored through arguments. It's restored through consistency over time. I no longer speak publicly about my family, not out of secrecy, but out of choice. Some stories don't need to be revisited once their lesson has been learned. The river water moved quietly beneath the dock as the morning light grew stronger. And in that stillness, I felt something simple and profound settle fully inside me. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you no longer owe explanations to people who chose not to understand you. Before I left the dock that morning, I took one last look at the envelope in my hand, then placed it into the trash bin near the parking lot. Because I didn't need to keep proof anymore. Truth had already done its work. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced betrayal from people you trusted most, tell me in the comments what helped you reclaim your peace. Your experiences matter more than you think. And if you want to hear another story about quiet strength, unexpected justice, and the power of boundaries, stay with me, because sometimes the most powerful revenge stories begin long before anyone realizes they're being written.